The judge laughed when she cried about missing court for her daughter's emergency. What he didn't know, her estranged brother was a U.S. attorney, and he had just walked in with receipts. The courtroom in Toledo, Ohio smelled faintly of old paper, burnt coffee, and that strange mix of cold air and anxiety. Monique Ellison stood behind the scratched wooden defendant's table, clutching a worn-out manila folder. Her knuckles were white, her cheeks wet. She'd stopped trying to hide the tears 5 minutes ago. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cracking like a weak radio signal. "I wasn't trying to disrespect the court. I had a medical emergency. My daughter, she has asthma. I had to take her to the ER." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't beg. She just tried to speak like someone who thought she'd be treated like a person. But Judge Perry Benedict didn't even look up at first. He flipped through a document slowly, as if her words were just noise in the room. When he did finally look at her, he curled his upper lip just slightly. That little smirk. "Ms. Ellison," he said dryly, "you people always seem to have a crisis right when it's time to take responsibility." The courtroom went dead quiet. Then came a few faint laughs. 2 folks in the gallery couldn't hold it in. Even the bailiff shifted on his feet. Nobody corrected the judge. Nobody spoke up. Not even her public defender. Monique didn't speak again. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She'd been called many things before. But this? Being laughed at in front of strangers, her daughter's medical charts in her folder, and a judge acting like she was wasting his morning. It felt like something broke inside her. She looked down at her shoes. One was stuffed, the sole coming loose. She suddenly felt stupid for wearing them, for thinking she had a chance. Judge Benedict tapped his pen against his notepad. "The court finds the mother in violation of the prior custody agreement. Supervised visits are suspended until the next review, 6 months from today." That was it. No more words. Just a decision that dropped like a gavel to the chest. Her eyes snapped to the gallery. No friendly faces. No one she knew. Just a few bored people waiting for their turn. But then, the door at the back of the courtroom opened, and someone walked in. He wasn't in a rush, but he moved like a man who knew exactly where he was going. Navy blue suit, black leather briefcase, government badge clipped to his belt. Monique didn't see him at first, but the court clerk did. So did the judge. And for the first time all morning, Benedict blinked. His smirk vanished. The man sat quietly in the second row. Didn't speak, just watched. Monique turned slightly, her eyes locking onto the figure. She froze. It had been 5 years, but she would know that face anywhere. Julian. Her brother. She hadn't seen him since the funeral, since the fight, since he left Toledo for good. But he wasn't here for small talk. And something about the way he was looking at the judge? You could feel it in the air. This wasn't going to be just another court hearing. Julian Prescott hadn't planned on ever stepping foot in Toledo again. He'd left the city behind after law school, vowing never to return to the place that took more than it ever gave. For a long time, he stuck to that vow. He buried himself in work, rising fast through the ranks in Washington, D.C., until the title Assistant U.S. Attorney became more than just a line on his business card. It became who he was. But then, 3 nights ago, a voicemail shattered that distance like glass. "Julian, it's Monique. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but they're trying to take Layla. I messed up. I missed court. And the judge, he said things I just don't know what to do anymore." She didn't cry in the message. That's what got to him. He replayed it 3 times, then packed a bag. 5 years. 5 years of silence. No birthdays, no holiday texts. Not even after Mama died. The last time they spoke, it ended with slammed doors and ugly words. Julian had accused her of never getting her life together. She told him he thought he was better than everyone just because he got out, that he had no idea what it meant to raise a kid alone. She was right. He didn't. But the way she'd said, "They're trying to take Layla," Something about that shook him. He still remembered Layla's tiny face from the last photo Monique had sent him. Chubby cheeks, gap-toothed grin, braids all over the place. That little girl was the last good thing between them. And now she was caught in the middle of this. Julian hadn't asked permission to show up. He wasn't sure she even wanted him there. But some instincts don't need approval. You just act. On the flight in, he pulled Monique's court file. As a federal attorney, he had access to public records that most people didn't. What he read on the plane made his stomach turn. There had been 3 prior hearings. Each time, Monique showed up alone. No legal counsel, no representation. Just her, trying to navigate a system designed to swallow people like her whole. And the judge? Perry Benedict, a name Julian had come across once before, in a separate misconduct complaint. Buried, quietly closed, never publicized. That case had been dropped. But now, seeing this, the pattern was becoming hard to ignore. By the time Julian stepped into that courtroom, he wasn't just there as Monique's brother. He was there as someone who knew exactly what power looked like when it thought no one was watching. And as he sat down, watching the final moments of the hearing play out, he didn't look at Monique with pity. He looked at that judge and made a silent promise. Not today. But before he could speak, he needed Monique to understand one thing. He wasn't here to save her. He was here to stand beside her and make damn sure she was heard this time. The courtroom was in cleanup mode. Papers shuffled, lawyers whispered, and people began collecting their coats. The judge reached for his gavel to close the session, but Julian stood. "Excuse me, Your Honor," he said, voice calm but loud enough to cut through the room. Heads turned. Monique froze. The bailiff looked confused. Even the court reporter hesitated, fingers hovering above the keys. Judge Benedict raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" Julian stepped into the open aisle and approached the bench slowly. "Julian Prescott, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Washington District. Bar number ending in 4419. He pulled out a folded ID, let the judge see the seal. The judge's face shifted. He didn't smile, didn't frown. Just adjusted in his chair, like something had just crawled under his robe. "Interesting timing, Mr. Prescott," he said. "This isn't a federal case." "No," Julian said. "But it's one that just got my attention." He turned briefly toward Monique, who stood motionless, lips parted like she couldn't decide whether to speak or breathe. "Miss Ellison," Julian said gently, "may I represent you?" She blinked, a silent pause in a room full of noise. "Yes," she whispered. Julian didn't look back at the judge right away. He faced the court clerk instead. "I'd like to file a motion to reopen the custody review, based on procedural misconduct and the absence of adequate legal representation during prior hearings." Judge Benedict leaned forward. "This is highly irregular." Julian held the judge's gaze. "So is publicly mocking a defendant with a hot mic." A few people in the gallery murmured. The bailiff stepped forward, but stopped when the judge lifted a hand. The tension in the room was thick, but Julian's tone didn't rise. He didn't need to shout. His calmness had weight. "I've reviewed the transcripts," Julian continued. "I've reviewed your prior rulings. There's a documented pattern here. Denials without hearings, failure to notify opposing counsel of schedule changes, multiple unrecorded sidebars, not to mention the language used today. Would you like me to read it back to you?" The judge said nothing. Julian stepped forward, placing a printout on the clerk's desk. "That's your voice, Your Honor. Clear as day." He turned back to Monique, now seated behind him. "This is your hearing now," he said to her, not the judge. "You get to speak without fear, without being dismissed. I'll make sure of that." Monique looked down at her lap, lips trembling. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was standing alone in the middle of a storm. Judge Benedict cleared his throat. "This court is not subject to threats. I'm not threatening you," Julian replied. "I'm watching you. That's the part you're not used to." For a long second, neither man moved. Then the judge leaned back in his chair, face tight. "The court will recess until after lunch. Both parties will return at 1:15 with all documentation." Julian nodded once. "See you then." He turned and walked back to Monique, motioning for her to stand. They left the courtroom together. Outside, in the hallway, Monique finally found her voice. "Why are you here, Julian? After all this time?" He looked down at her. "Because you asked. You might not have said it out loud, but I heard it." She stared at him for a second, eyes full of disbelief. "You're not mad anymore?" "I am," he said, "but I'm more mad at what they've been allowed to do to you." But anger alone wasn't going to fix this. What came next had to be about the facts and the fight. The courthouse cafeteria was nearly empty, just a few folks hunched over vending machine sandwiches and lukewarm coffee. Monique sat across from Julian at a corner table, fingers fidgeting with her ride badge from the hospital. "I didn't know who else to call," she said quietly. "You didn't?" Julian replied. "You just left a message." She gave a half smile, the kind people use when they're too tired to laugh. "Same thing, isn't it?" Julian studied her face. Time had added lines beneath her eyes, a tiredness in her posture. But she was still his sister. Still that same stubborn girl who used to chase him down the street with a hairbrush yelling about fairness. "You shouldn't have been going to court alone, Monique." "I know that now," she said. "But legal aid's a joke. I waited 2 months for a call back. And then they told me the day before my hearing that they didn't have capacity. Layla was sick. I couldn't miss her treatment. So I missed court. Simple as that." Julian nodded, but said nothing. She wasn't making excuses. She was just telling the truth. They went back upstairs 15 minutes early. Julian spent the time reviewing the hearing transcripts he'd printed that morning. Highlighted comments, skipped steps, everything that smelled off. When 1:15 hit, they walked back into the courtroom together. The energy had shifted. This time, no one laughed when Monique walked in. This time, people sat up straighter. Judge Benedict returned to the bench, jaw tight, face pale. "We're reconvening the matter of Ellison versus Harris. Mr. Prescott, you've filed a motion to reopen the custody decision on grounds of misconduct?" "Yes," Julian said. "And I'd like to submit supporting documentation, transcripts, prior hearing notes, and a request to bring in an independent court officer to review the judge's case history on similar matters." The judge scoffed. "This court has nothing to hide." "Then you won't mind if we shine some light?" Julian said, cool as ever. Gasps rose from the back of the room. One of the reporters from the local paper had slipped into a seat near the rear. Word was already getting around. Judge Benedict tried to regain control. "Mr. Prescott, you are skating on the edge of contempt. And you," Julian said, "are skating on the edge of removal." He handed a packet to the clerk, then turned to the gallery. "This isn't just about one ruling. This is about a pattern. A pattern where people who don't have lawyers don't get justice." Monique swallowed hard. Her hands shook in her lap. But when Julian looked back at her, she gave the smallest nod. He was right. And maybe, just maybe, people were finally listening. Across the aisle, the father of Layla, Gregory Harris, leaned in and whispered something to his attorney. The attorney frowned and jotted a note. Whatever confidence they walked in with was now sliding through the cracks. The judge tried to pivot. "We'll allow a continuance to review the evidence. 2 weeks." "No, Your Honor." Julian interrupted. "My client's rights have been trampled long enough. We ask for immediate reconsideration of the visitation order while the misconduct investigation proceeds. She hasn't seen her daughter in 43 days. The judge hesitated. The bailiff stepped forward, leaning toward the bench. A quiet exchange followed, muffled, tense. The judge rubbed his temple. Finally, he exhaled through his nose. "Temporary visitation reinstated. 2 supervised hours per week, starting tomorrow." Monique gasped. Her fingers flew to her mouth. Julian didn't look at the judge again. He just placed his hand gently on his sister's shoulder. The fight wasn't over, but it was a start. But even a small win in a place like this could shake the walls harder than anyone expected. Julian didn't waste time. That same evening, he filed an official judicial conduct complaint with the Ohio Board of Professional Conduct. He included annotated court transcripts, testimony from Monique, and even a copy of an old case he remembered seeing, State v. Kelly Moreno, where Judge Benedict had dismissed a young mother's plea for reduced sentencing because her tears won't pay her rent. He'd pulled that line from the transcript, word for word. No one had challenged it back then. Now, it was back in the light. By the end of the week, reporters from the Toledo Sentinel and even an outlet from Columbus were digging deeper. 3 separate public defenders came forward, anonymously at first, confirming similar treatment. Dismissive, abrupt, cruel even, especially when the client looked a certain way or lacked an attorney who could push back. Monique kept showing up for her supervised visits. Layla was shy at first, quiet, watching, unsure. But during the 3rd visit, she slipped her tiny hand into her mother's and said, "Are we going to be together again soon?" Monique didn't promise anything, but she held her daughter close and whispered, "I'm trying, baby. I'm trying hard." Meanwhile, Judge Benedict began to feel the heat. A memo from the state's Judicial Review Board was delivered to his office. The chief judge of the district requested a formal inquiry into all his recent family court decisions. He tried to go on as usual, but the confidence was gone. His court sessions were quieter. Lawyers watched him more closely. Even his clerk seemed slower to nod when he gave an order. Julian didn't return to D.C. right away. He'd taken a temporary leave to stay near Monique, not just for her, but for the process, for the message it sent. One evening, as they sat in the living room of Monique's small apartment, she handed him a bowl of reheated spaghetti. They ate in silence for a while before she finally asked, "Why didn't you come home all those years?" Julian wiped his mouth with a napkin, thinking hard before he spoke. "I felt like I didn't belong here anymore. Like being gone meant I'd left for good. But deep down, I think I was just afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of being back in the middle of everything I couldn't fix." Monique nodded slowly. "You couldn't fix it all. But you came when it counted." He looked over at her, and for a moment the weight between them felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter. The next day, a letter arrived at the courthouse. Judge Perry Benedict was to be placed under temporary suspension pending the outcome of a formal investigation. It wasn't a victory parade, no handcuffs, no public scolding. But it meant something. The court couldn't just keep turning its head. Not anymore. Monique found herself standing outside that same courtroom weeks later, this time with Layla holding her hand. No shame, no folder clutched to her chest, just a quiet confidence. Julian joined them in the hallway, adjusting his tie. "Ready?" She nodded. Inside, the court had appointed a new judge, Marianne Delacroix, firm but fair. She reviewed the case history in full, gave both sides time to speak, and addressed Monique directly. "Miss Ellison," she said, "you've faced repeated setbacks in this case, many outside of your control. Today we're making space to correct that." Monique didn't cry this time. She stood tall. She spoke clearly. And when it was over, she walked out with her head high. But even then, she knew this wasn't about just one case. It was about showing the system that someone had been watching. And this time, they were watching back. The final hearing came faster than anyone expected. It had been 3 months since Julian first walked into that courtroom. 3 months of digging, filing, emailing, following up. 3 months of Monique showing up to every supervised visit, every parenting class, every check-in. She did it without complaining, without skipping, without shortcuts. Julian had seen a lot of people fold under pressure, but his sister didn't. Not this time. Inside the courtroom, Layla's father, Gregory Harris, sat with his attorney, arms crossed, eyes darting to the new judge, Marianne Delacroix. He hadn't said much since the suspension. There was no smirk, no swagger, just silence. Judge Delacroix adjusted her glasses. After reviewing all submitted documentation and the defendant's recent compliance, the court finds sufficient grounds to reinstate shared custody between the parents, with a gradual transition to unsupervised visitation. Monique didn't react at first. The words took a second to land. Then slowly her shoulders dropped. Her hands unclenched. and she let out a breath like she'd been holding it for years. Julian grinned, but only a little. He knew this wasn't the end of the road. It was more like the beginning of something she should have had a long time ago. Gregory's lawyer stood to object, but Judge Delacroix held up her hand. "This court has seen enough. You may not like the decision, but the law supports it." And for once, it was applied fairly. Outside the courtroom, Monique stepped into the sun and just stood there for a moment. The wind blew her hair back. She looked taller than she had in months. Julian walked beside her, silent for a beat. "You did good in there," he said. She looked over, smiling. "So did you." They stood on the courthouse steps, watching as people filtered out, mostly strangers, but some who had stayed after their own hearings, just to see how this one turned out. "I thought it was over," she said. "Back when I was crying in that courtroom, I thought I lost her." "You didn't," Julian said. "They just made you think you had no fight left." She nodded, wiping her cheek. "I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." Monique paused. "Yeah, I do. You showed up." They walked back to her car together, and Layla, waiting in the back seat with a book and a juice box, spotted her mom and grinned wide. "Mommy!" she yelled, pressing her face to the window. Monique opened the door and hugged her tight, tears forming again. But this time, they were the kind that don't carry shame. Later that week, Julian packed his bag and prepared to head back to D.C. Monique made him coffee for the road and tucked a photo of her and Layla into the front pocket of his laptop case without saying anything. He found it on the train and smiled quietly to himself. A few rows away, a woman watched him and asked, "You look like you just got good news." Julian thought about everything: his sister's strength, the fight they didn't back down from, and the judge who finally had to answer for something. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I guess I did." But what stayed with him wasn't the ruling or the courtroom speeches. It was the look in Monique's eyes. Proof that even when the system gets it wrong, people can still fight to make it right. 2 months later, Julian sat in his office in D.C., the sound of traffic just barely muffled behind the thick glass. He stared at the framed photo on his desk. Monique and Layla on a park bench. Layla laughing, Monique mid-sentence, hand raised as if she was telling a story right in that moment. That photo wasn't just decoration. It was a reminder. Because for all the cases Julian had handled, drug conspiracies, financial crimes, political scandals, nothing had ever felt like what happened back in Toledo. This wasn't about prestige or career wins. It was about a system that had been so used to functioning in the dark, it never expected anyone to shine a light. It was about how easy it was for someone like his sister to be treated like background noise, disposable, unimportant, and how close she came to believing it. He thought about what would have happened if she hadn't left that voicemail, if she hadn't swallowed her pride, if he hadn't listened. The difference between justice and injustice? Sometimes it's just who's watching. Back in Toledo, Monique was rebuilding piece by piece. Her work at the hospital had picked up again. She got a second-hand car, a newer couch, started looking at apartments with a second bedroom. Layla was in a new school closer to her place, and every Friday, Monique helped her pick out a weekend book from the local library. Things weren't perfect. She and Gregory still didn't get along. The system still made everything harder than it had to be. But she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was parenting. At night, she'd sometimes call Julian, not to talk about the case, not to vent, just to talk. One night, she told him, "I still feel like I'm waiting for it all to fall apart again." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You won't. Because this time, you're not doing it alone." That stuck with her. People think justice is a straight line. It's not. It's a maze. Full of corners, closed doors, people who pretend they're helping when they're just holding the line. Sometimes the only way through it is with someone who knows the map. Julian hadn't saved her. That's not how this works. He didn't swoop in and fix her life. But he showed up. He stood beside her. He made sure the people in power knew they weren't invisible. And for Layla, that made all the difference. In the end, this wasn't just about a court ruling or a misconduct report. It was about reminding people of something simple but powerful. Everyone deserves to be heard. Everyone deserves a shot. And when the system forgets that, it's on us to make noise until it remembers. So if you're watching this, if you've ever felt dismissed, ignored, or powerless, know this: you don't have to shout to be strong. You don't have to be perfect to be worthy. And you don't need a badge to hold people accountable. You just need to speak. And if your voice shakes, speak anyway. Because someone's listening. And sometimes that someone shows up when you least expect it, wearing a suit, carrying a briefcase, and walking into a courtroom like he already knew what time it was. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, or made you rethink what justice looks like, don't just scroll. Share it. Comment. Subscribe. Let stories like Monique's be heard, because for every courtroom that silences someone, there's a crowd outside waiting to say, "We saw it, and we won't forget."